Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a philosopher or conqueror, but with something humbler and infinitely stranger. Mushrooms. Fungi that grow in the dark, feed on decay, and somehow convinced humanity they hold the secrets of the universe. From ancient shamans to medieval alchemists, mushrooms have been medicine, food, poison, and occasionally divine customer service. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. It's around 40,000 years ago, and humanity is having a rough time. You're barefoot, hungry, and one bad winter away from extinction. The menu consists of whatever doesn't run away fast enough. Roots, berries, and things that look edible if you squint hard enough. That's when someone spots it. A small, colourful lump growing out of a log. It doesn't move, it doesn't fight back, and it looks intriguing. Someone, probably the bravest idiot in the tribe, decides to eat it. Within an hour, they're either dead, enlightened, or declaring war on the moon. Congratulations! That was humanity's first recorded experiment with mushrooms. Early humans didn't have field guides or fun guy puns. They had trial and error, mostly error. Some mushrooms filled bellies, others filled burial mounds. But every so often, one would send the lucky diner into what scientists today call a hallucinogenic state, and what cavemen probably called talking to the thunder god. Archaeologists have found prehistoric rock art in Spain and Algeria that shows figures dancing beside mushroom shapes. Some say it depicts early shamanic rituals, others say it's just ancient graffiti by someone very, very high. Either way, the evidence is clear. Humans were tripping long before they were writing. Back then, mushrooms weren't recreational. They were mysterious. They appeared overnight, had no roots, and grew from death and decay, literally sprouting out of rot. It's no wonder early people thought they were messages from another world. If you're living in a cave and a glowing fungus shows you cosmic geometry, you don't question it. You start a religion. Some anthropologists even believe that early humans' first taste of spirituality, their first sense of awe, may have come from mushrooms. They didn't build temples or write hymns yet, but they had a forest, a fire, and something that made them stare at the stars like they finally understood the joke. So yes, the first human to use mushrooms probably did it by mistake. But that mistake might have changed everything. The birth of curiosity, art, and delusion in equal measure. Because humanity's oldest story isn't about discovering fire. It's about what happens right after someone says, "What's the worst that could happen?" If before it was about the brave idiot who ate the first mushroom, now it is about what happened after everyone realized the idiot might have actually been onto something. Fast forward a few thousand years, and humans are still mostly naked, afraid, and extremely curious. Somewhere in prehistoric Spain and Algeria, people start painting caves, not just animals and hunts, but tall, dancing figures surrounded by mushrooms. It's either the first art gallery or the first bad trip memorial. Archaeologists call these the Tassili mushroom figures. They think they represent early shamanic rituals, moments where tribes mixed hunger, smoke, and psilocybin into something that felt suspiciously like religion. Because when you've spent your entire life fearing thunder, suddenly seeing the sky melt feels deeply profound. These early mushroom users weren't stoners. They were pioneers of the mind, experimenting without knowing they were experimenting. No safety gear, no water, no sitter, just primal curiosity and a cave full of echoing voices that may or may not have been real. Picture it. The tribe gathers around a fire. The shaman, eyes wide, holds up a handful of mushrooms and says, "Tonight, we meet the ancestors." Everyone cheers. 30 minutes later, they're crawling on the floor trying to talk to a rock. Religion is born. Some modern researchers think these experiences gave humans a sense of symbolism, the ability to imagine gods, spirits, and meaning beyond survival. In short, mushrooms might have accidentally invented mythology. You can almost hear one early human whispering, "Bro, what if the stars are just holes in the sky?" And everyone nodding like it's Nobel-level genius. Of course, not every trip was transcendent. Some were just unfortunate. The same cave art that shows mushroom dancers also shows people lying flat, probably the ones who miscalculated the dosage. Spiritual enlightenment had a learning curve, and most of it involved vomiting. Still, these psychedelic rituals spread far and wide, through Africa, Eurasia, even early Siberia. Proof that wherever humans went, mushrooms followed, whispering new realities from the forest floor. By the end of the Stone Age, we weren't just surviving nature anymore. We were trying to understand it, one bad trip at a time. By now, humanity had realized something profound. Mushrooms didn't just make the world prettier, they made it weirder, and apparently that was good for business if you were a shaman. Welcome to ancient Siberia, home of endless snow, freezing wind, and the people who decided that the best way to contact the spirit world was through mild poisoning. The shamans here were the original pharmacists, therapists, and stand-up comedians, all rolled into one trembling, half-naked person beating a drum in minus 20 degrees Celsius weather. Their drug of choice? The red and white Amanita muscaria, the iconic fairy tale mushroom. Bright, beautiful, and incredibly toxic, basically nature's way of saying, yes, but no. It caused visions, euphoria, and a strong urge to tell people what the spirits thought of their attitude. It also caused death, if you weren't careful. Which explains why the job had such high turnover. But Siberian shamans were nothing if not resourceful. They noticed that reindeer loved eating these mushrooms, and somehow didn't die. Instead, the animals stumbled around joyfully, probably inventing Christmas in the process. The shamans made the logical leap. If reindeer could handle it, so could they. Unfortunately, they couldn't. So they developed a workaround. They drank the reindeer's urine. It sounds disgusting because it is. But the psychoactive compounds passed through the animal filtered and safer to consume. So yes, the first known instance of recycling was a man drinking reindeer pee to talk to the moon. Humanity's creativity truly knows no limits. The resulting rituals were spectacular. Shamans would enter trances, claim to fly, and describe meetings with ancestors or animal spirits. Villagers believed them, probably because anyone willing to drink urine and scream into the void had earned some respect. For all their insanity, these rituals worked, at least socially. They unified tribes, explained the unexplainable, and gave people hope that someone, somewhere, knew what was going on. The shaman was part therapist, part priest, and part performance artist, with an impressive tolerance. So, while modern spirituality involves incense and playlists, ancient spirituality was mostly frostbite, hallucinations, and second-hand reindeer urine. And yet, somehow, those frozen psychonauts laid the foundation for humanity's oldest idea, that maybe, just maybe, the meaning of life could be found in a mushroom if you survived it. While Siberian shamans were busy drinking reindeer urine and calling it enlightenment, the people of the Americas were developing their own, far more dignified relationship with mushrooms. In the lush jungles and high temples of Mesoamerica, fungi weren't just food, they were theology. The Maya, Mixtec, and Aztecs all used psychedelic mushrooms in religious ceremonies. They called them Teonanacatl, the flesh of the gods, which, to be fair, is a better marketing name than possibly lethal forest sponge. Eating them wasn't recreation, it was communion. Participants believed the mushrooms allowed them to talk to deities, ancestors, and occasionally themselves. Ceremonies were elaborate affairs. Picture this: incense smoke thick in the air, chanting priests, torches flickering off stone walls, and a plate of mushrooms passed around like the world's most confusing dinner party. Soon, everyone seeing serpents made of light, gods descending from the stars, and probably regretting how many they ate. Spanish missionaries, later stumbled upon these rituals and immediately declared them satanic. Because nothing says cultural understanding like showing up to someone's sacred ceremony and calling it demonic. Reports from the 16th century describe priests consuming mushrooms that cause madness and prophetic speech, which, to be fair, is exactly what prophecy sounds like when you're sober. To the Aztecs, though, these experiences were divine truth. Mushrooms were sacred bridges, a way to experience life and death in one sitting. Warriors ate them before battle to see visions of victory, or more realistically, to stop caring about dying. The nobility used them in feasts, mixing ecstasy with cosmic symbolism. The gods approved, the stomachs did not. When the conquistadors arrived, they banned the practice, burned the temples, and forced conversions, because clearly the best way to save a soul is to ruin the party first. The rituals went underground, surviving in whispers and secret ceremonies that still echo in parts of Mexico today. So while Europe was terrified of mushrooms, Mesoamerica had already mastered them, philosophically, spiritually, and gastronomically. They didn't just use mushrooms to escape reality. They used them to understand it. Unfortunately, Europe's contribution to the discussion was, as usual, "Stop that, it looks fun." While the Aztecs were chatting with their gods through mushrooms, the ancient Egyptians were busy turning fungi into both food and myth, which is what Egypt did with pretty much everything. If something looked mysterious, glowed strangely, or smelled like it came from another world, they assumed it was divine. And mushrooms? They checked all three boxes. The Egyptians called them the food of immortality. Pharaohs believed they were sent from Osiris himself, a gift from the afterlife, sprouting from the dark, fertile soil of the Nile. Which makes sense, because nothing says eternal life like something growing out of decomposition. They treated mushrooms as a delicacy reserved for royalty and priests. Commoners were banned from eating them, the world's first recorded instance of gatekeeping psychedelics. In paintings and papyri, mushrooms appeared in the hands of healers, high priests, and gods, though curiously, never anyone smiling. Mushrooms also found their way into medicine. Egyptian physicians crushed them into poultices for inflammation and digestive issues, proving once again that ancient medicine was mostly just rub this on it and pray. They were stored in apothecaries alongside lotus flowers, honey, and other natural remedies that worked mainly on optimism. Of course, not everyone saw mushrooms as holy. Some saw them as a very convenient way to solve political problems. When Emperor Claudius later died of a poisoned mushroom, yes, the Romans learned from the Egyptians, the phrase, "the food of the gods," suddenly took on a darker meaning. Egypt may not have invented the mushroom assassination, but it definitely would have appreciated the aesthetic. Still, the Egyptians' reverence for fungi wasn't entirely misplaced. They noticed mushrooms appeared overnight, seemingly from nowhere, and decayed just as mysteriously. To them, that cycle mirrored death and rebirth. The same philosophy that built pyramids, preserved mummies, and invented the concept of pharaoh still working remotely from the afterlife. So, in true Egyptian fashion, mushrooms became both divine and deadly, a symbol of eternity that could still kill you before dinner. They didn't know about spores, enzymes, or mycelium networks. They just knew that if a plant popped out of the ground without explanation, it was either sacred or a lawsuit waiting to happen. By the time mushrooms reached ancient Greece, humanity had already figured out two important things. Alcohol makes people loud, and fungi make people weird. So naturally, the Greeks combined both into something they called religion. Welcome to the Eleusinian Mysteries, a secret initiation ceremony so exclusive that participants were legally forbidden to talk about it. Which is impressive, considering most of them were probably too high to form complete sentences anyway. Every year, thousands of Athenians, including philosophers, statesmen, and the occasional drunk playwright, travelled to Eleusis to experience enlightenment through a drink called kykion. It was a barley-based brew, possibly laced with ergot, a fungus that grows on grain and happens to contain the chemical foundation for LSD. That's right. The path to divine truth may have started with a mouldy smoothie, The ritual itself was part spiritual awakening, part group hallucination. Participants fasted, drank kykeon, and then wandered through torchlit tunnels, while priests shouted cryptic phrases about death and rebirth. By dawn, everyone emerged claiming to have seen the mysteries. Historians still argue about what that means, but judging by the art, it involved a lot of nudity, snakes, and vague optimism. Of course, ancient Greece was already full of people who didn't need help questioning reality. Plato and Aristotle built entire careers on confusing their students. But the mysteries took it further. They promised first-hand experience of eternity. Or, at the very least, a fantastic excuse to skip work for 3 days. It wasn't just about drugs, though. It was about confronting mortality in a world that didn't yet have Netflix. The Greeks genuinely believed the kykeon ritual could dissolve fear and unite mortals with the gods. The fact that it also made you see purple horses was just a bonus. Naturally, the Romans later banned it. They called it unseemly and dangerously joyful, which, in Roman terms, meant fun and therefore illegal. So while most of Greece was inventing democracy and geometry, Eleusis was out there quietly inventing psychedelia. And they might have been onto something. Thousands swore it changed their lives. But let's be honest. So would accidentally discovering LSD in your breakfast. The Greeks may have seen mushrooms as divine portals to enlightenment, but the Romans took one look at them and said, "That would go great with olive oil." To Rome, everything was a matter of class. The upper crust, the senators, generals, and anyone who owned more than one bath, developed a taste for mushrooms. They were exotic, fragrant, and most importantly, expensive. Eating them wasn't about nutrition, it was about status. The same logic still applies today with truffles and overpriced water. Roman banquets were spectacular displays of excess, tables piled high with roasted peacocks, honeyed dormice, and, of course, sautéed mushrooms. Guests didn't ask what kind. That's because mushrooms came in 2 varieties, delicious and fatal. It was like Russian roulette with better seasoning. The Emperor Claudius learned that the hard way. History says his ambitious wife, Agrippina the Younger, served him a plate of mushrooms in 54 CE, seasoned, succulent, and laced with a generous sprinkle of poison. He died shortly after, and Agrippina calmly declared her teenage son Nero the new emperor. Rome mourned briefly, then added mushroom to the list of political assassination tools, right between dagger and stairs. Romans even gave mushrooms a nickname after that, Cibus deorum, food of the gods, which is ironic, because the gods were apparently hungry for emperors. Still, the culinary craze continued. Mushroom dishes stayed popular, partly because nobody wanted to look suspiciously sober at a feast, but not all fungi were deadly. Roman physicians like Dioscorides catalogued edible species for medical use, to treat wounds, soothe pain, and occasionally purify the humours, which was ancient code for cause diarrhea. Farmers used mushrooms to fertilize fields, while philosophers debated whether they were plants, animals, or divine mistakes. To most Romans, mushrooms symbolized life's great gamble. Everything looked beautiful until it wasn't. The same could be said of the empire itself. So while Greece saw mushrooms as messengers of the gods, Rome saw them as garnish, unless, of course, you were on Agrippina's bad side. Then they were destiny. By the time Nero finished tuning his lyre and setting things on fire, the lesson was clear. Mushrooms may not be evil, but they do seem to have excellent timing. While Rome was turning mushrooms into murder weapons, the ancient Chinese were quietly turning them into medicine. Because where Europe saw a suspicious fungus, China saw a potential cure, or at least a really impressive excuse to avoid dying. Enter the legendary Emperor Shen Nong, the mythical father of herbal medicine. Around 200 BCE, he was said to have personally tested hundreds of plants, poisons, and fungi to see what worked and what didn't. According to legend, he died doing this, which is either heroic or the most predictable outcome in medical history. But before he went, he supposedly discovered a very special mushroom, Lingji, also known as the mushroom of immortality. It didn't actually make anyone immortal, but it did make them feel optimistic about the possibility, which is 90% of medicine anyway. Lingji, today known as reishi, became the gold standard of health in Taoist philosophy, a fungus that balanced the spirit, strengthened qi, and boosted vitality. In other words, the ancient world's version of a supplement ad. Artists painted it in scrolls, emperors drank it as tea, and alchemists tried to combine it with mercury, which was a bold and terminal choice. For the rich, Lingji symbolized divine harmony. For the poor, it symbolized something you'll never afford. Meanwhile, Japan and Korea were also developing their own fungal fandoms. Samurai prized mushrooms like matsutake for strength, while healers brewed psilocybin cousins for mental clarity, or more realistically, confusion with style. Over in India, Ayurvedic physicians used fungi for fevers and spirit healing, proving mushrooms had gone fully global long before fast food did. But China was still the undisputed master of mushroom mysticism. Imperial gardens grew them, scholars wrote about them, and Taoist monks meditated on their form, believing they embodied the balance between life and decay, which is a polite way of saying beautiful corpse. And so, while Rome collapsed under its own ambition, China was busy drinking hot fungus water and calling it enlightenment. Thousands of years later, modern science finally confirmed that Lingji actually does have immune-boosting properties, meaning Emperor Shen Nong's painful career in self-poisoning wasn't entirely for nothing. In short, the West used mushrooms to kill emperors. The East used them to become one. As Europe was busy seasoning emperors with poison and China was sipping immortality tea, the Persian world took a more methodical, though equally adventurous, approach to mushrooms. Here, fungi weren't just mystic symbols or culinary experiments, they were data points. The great polymath Avicenna, or Ibn Sina to his friends, assuming he had any who could keep up, documented mushrooms in his canon of medicine around the 11th century. His verdict? Some were healing, some were deadly, and some were best left to God's understanding, which in medieval doctor speak means, I tried it and I regret it. Persian physicians were among the first to realize that mushrooms could serve both as cure and curse, depending on dosage, color, and whether your patient had recently angered the spirits. They used non-toxic species to treat inflammation, ulcers, and infections, often grinding them into bitter pastes that cured you mostly by making you never want to be sick again. But fungi in Persia weren't purely medicinal. They were also mystical. Sufi poets wrote of plants that whisper, describing mushrooms as living metaphors for divine revelation. Imagine a 12th century mystic staring at a toadstool and saying, "Behold, the universe hides within decay." Then imagine his apprentice trying to pretend that made sense. There are also hints of psychoactive mushrooms making their way into ritual gatherings, early Sufi zikr ceremonies where rhythmic chanting, whirling, and herbal mixtures helped participants reach states of ecstasy. Whether those herbs included mushrooms or just really strong mint remains up for debate, but considering the poetry output of the time, something hallucinogenic was clearly happening. Trade routes only fueled the obsession. Persian apothecaries collected rare fungi from the Caucasus, India, and Central Asia, labeling them with cryptic notes like strengthens memory or opens the soul. You know, the kind of claims still found on wellness products today. So while medieval Europe was burning witches for knowing what mushrooms were, Persian scholars were busy cataloguing them, debating their humours, and occasionally ingesting the wrong one for science. The Persian Empire's approach to mushrooms summed up their entire worldview, equal parts reason and mysticism, with a healthy dose of chaos. They didn't always find enlightenment, but they did invent the Middle Eastern version of microdosing, drinking something strange, writing poetry, and pretending it was for research. By the time the Silk Road was in full swing, humans had been eating, worshipping, and dying from mushrooms for millennia. So naturally, it was time to start exporting the experience. The Silk Road wasn't just a highway of silk and spices. It was humanity's first global supply chain for weird ideas and questionable snacks. Caravans left China laden with silk and dried lingji, while Persian traders packed medicinal fungi in jars labelled health tonic, which probably translated to good luck. By the time they reached the Mediterranean, no one knew what they were selling anymore, but everyone pretended to understand because it looked expensive. Mushrooms became part of this vast cultural exchange, carried by merchants, monks, and wanderers who believed that anything that grew overnight and glowed faintly in the dark must be worth sharing. The result? A trade in spores that no one controlled and everyone misunderstood. In India, mushrooms blended seamlessly into Ayurvedic medicine, curing everything from melancholy to spirit imbalance. In Persia, they were ground into love potions and truth elixirs. In China, they stayed the VIPs of herbalism, served in imperial teas that promised eternal youth. Still a better deal than what European nobles were drinking. Along the way, some fungi got reputations they never asked for. The red and white Amanita muscaria, already a Siberian favourite, made its way south, inspiring folk tales of talking animals and flying carpets. Historians now suspect that at least a few early storytellers were, in fact, hallucinating, which honestly explains a lot about flying carpets. Meanwhile, the Mongols and Turkic tribes adopted mushrooms for endurance, dried, smoked and packed for long journeys. It didn't make them immortal, but it did make charging into battle at -40 degrees seem slightly less terrible. Every civilization added its own twist. Some turned mushrooms into sacred offerings, others turned them into snacks. Some saw them as divine messengers, others as digestive experiments. But across thousands of miles, one truth held firm. No one really knew what mushrooms were, and no one could stop eating them. So, by the time Europe finally rediscovered trade, the East had already been sending out spores of enlightenment for centuries. The Silk Road had officially gone fungal. If globalization had a smell back then, it was spice, sweat, and slightly suspicious mushrooms. By the Middle Ages, Europe had developed a complicated relationship with mushrooms. The kind of relationship where you both love something and suspect it's trying to kill you. The church, as usual, made things more complicated. If it grew in the dark, appeared overnight, or caused laughter, it was probably the devil's work, which, unfortunately, described most mushrooms perfectly, but not everyone got the memo. Deep inside monasteries, monks were quietly turning fungi into both food and medicine. These men were Europe's original scientists, endlessly curious, slightly bored, and desperate to find new things to ferment. They brewed beer, catalogued herbs, and when no one was watching, experimented with mushrooms like medieval Breaking Bad. To a monk in the 12th century, mushrooms were miracles of efficiency. They grew fast, required no ploughing, and didn't complain during prayer. Monasteries cultivated them in damp cellars and behind abbey walls, supposedly for healing purposes. Translation: Brother Matthew had a headache and an appetite for forbidden fungus soup. Some fungi were medicinal. The polyporous species were ground into salves to treat wounds, while others were mixed into tonics for excess melancholy, medieval code for "please stop crying during Vespers." And though no one openly admitted it, certain monasteries near the Alps reportedly had a few special mushrooms set aside for spiritual visions. They called it divine contemplation. Everyone else called it tripping in a robe. The irony was thick enough to spread on bread. The church banned hallucinogens as tools of the devil, yet its holiest men were documenting them in illuminated manuscripts with captions like Fungus Mirabilis. It was either theological hypocrisy or really advanced marketing. Meanwhile, peasants continued to forage mushrooms without guilt or permission. For them, it wasn't mysticism. It was dinner. They didn't care if it was sacred or cursed. If it fried well with butter, it was going in the pot. So in an age where laughing too loudly could get you exorcised, mushrooms remained Europe's quiet rebellion, hidden under cassocks, stewing in kitchens, and scribbled into the margins of prayer books. Because even in the age of faith and fire, There were still a few monks who believed enlightenment could be found, not just in scripture, but in a damp cellar with good lighting and questionable hygiene. If monks saw mushrooms as quiet miracles, the church saw them as something far more sinister, tools of witches, demons, and women who asked too many questions. By the 14th century, anything that caused unusual behaviour was considered a pact with the devil. And since mushrooms were famous for causing laughter, confusion, and nudity in fields, they fit the profile perfectly. This was the golden age of paranoia, the era where Europe collectively decided that women with gardens were dangerous. The so-called witches' ointments became the focus of moral panic. They allegedly contained herbs like belladonna, henbane, and yes, Amanita muscaria, the red and white mushroom that could make you believe your broomstick had a flight mode. People claimed witches rubbed these concoctions on their skin to fly to the Sabbath. In reality, they were probably lying naked in a shed, high as the stratosphere, and describing it with a lot of enthusiasm. Meanwhile, ergot fungus, the same grain mould that inspired the Greek kykeon, made surprise comebacks across Europe. Villages struck by ergotism, known as St. Anthony's fire, saw hallucinations, convulsions, and outbreaks of collective madness. To the church, this was proof of demonic activity. To modern medicine, it was proof that rye doesn't age well. Of course, no one knew that at the time. Entire communities blamed local women for the strange behaviour of their neighbours. One man danced naked in the market square, clearly witchcraft. Another saw angels made of bees. Definitely the devil. By the time anyone noticed the bread was glowing, the accused were already tied to a stake. But the association between mushrooms and witchcraft wasn't just fear, it was also fascination. Secretly, European elites were collecting and experimenting with these demonic plants. Physicians and alchemists kept them in their private gardens, labelling them as curiosities. Nothing says hypocrisy like banning something in public and snorting it in private. So while peasants risked burning for eating the wrong stew, scholars were busy tripping for research. The Middle Ages were weird that way. Public repression, private revelation, and a lot of accidental poisonings. The church may have tried to brand mushrooms as portals to hell, but all it really proved was that the devil had excellent taste in aesthetics. While the church was busy accusing every woman with a basket of herbs of witchcraft, some people quietly kept Western medicine from collapsing entirely. They weren't priests or scholars. They were folk healers, herbalists, and midwives. The stubborn few who understood that mushrooms could do more than summon Satan. These women, and the occasional bearded outlier, learned their craft from generations of observation. They knew which fungi cured wounds, which reduced fever, and which would send your soul on an unscheduled vacation. Their pharmacy wasn't stocked with relics or incense. It was baskets, jars, and a solid working knowledge of when not to eat something that glowed. Take Polyporus officinalis, used in Europe to treat infections centuries before antibiotics existed. Or Fomes fomentarius, the tinder fungus, which doubled as both wound dressing and primitive bandage. These women knew that the forest floor could save a life faster than any priest with a prayer book. But to the church, that kind of competence looked suspiciously like sorcery. So the witch hunts began. Every village had its share of wise women, and every inquisitor had a quota. If you could make a tonic that worked, you were accused of consorting with demons. If you failed, you were just bad at your job. Either way, someone got burned. The 15th century was basically a long, deeply unpleasant Yelp review for medieval healthcare. Still, knowledge survived in whispers. Recipes were passed secretly, often disguised as kitchen instructions. Boil 3 cups of milk and add a pinch of nightshade. Wasn't breakfast. It was code. Some monasteries even hired healing women in secret, because miracles were easier to explain when someone else did the work. Despite persecution, these healers influenced the first universities of medicine. Their remedies, mushrooms, herbs, tinctures, made their way into formal texts. The irony? The same people who condemned them later published their recipes under their own names. Medieval plagiarism was truly ahead of its time. In the end, these quiet healers bridged the gap between superstition and science. They were accused of witchcraft for doing what doctors now call clinical trials. So while inquisitors ranted about sin, midwives kept delivering babies, healers kept curing wounds, and the mushrooms, as always, just kept growing. By the time the Renaissance arrived, Europe had finally started to sober up, intellectually, at least. After centuries of burning people for knowing what fungus was, humanity decided maybe knowledge wasn't demonic after all. The printing press was spreading ideas faster than the plague, and curiosity was fashionable again. Mushrooms, once demonized, were cautiously stepping back into the spotlight, ideally not accompanied by screaming villagers. Naturalists began to catalogue the natural world in meticulous detail. Men like Pier Andrea Mattioli, a 16th century Italian physician, described dozens of mushroom species in his herbal compendiums, though his scientific process mostly involved poking them and writing, edible probably. Still, it was progress. For the first time, Europeans admitted that mushrooms might be more than Satan's garnishes. Meanwhile, alchemists, those glorious madmen with flasks and questionable hygiene, were fascinated by the way fungi appeared spontaneously. They saw them as proof of spontaneous generation, nature's way of saying, life just happens. If you left bread in a corner long enough, it grew intelligence, or at least penicillin. Alchemy was 10% chemistry, 90% optimism. Mushrooms also crept into art and symbolism. Renaissance painters, obsessed with the hidden layers of reality, slipped toadstools into forest scenes and religious iconography. Some art historians think the red and white Amanita muscaria even appeared in depictions of the Garden of Eden. A subtle wink suggesting Eve didn't eat an apple, but something a lot more interesting. In the courts, noble collectors kept cabinets of curiosities filled with seashells, fossils, and dried mushrooms. It was the era's version of a YouTube unboxing video, only with more Latin. Scholars debated whether fungi were plants, animals, or something in between. The correct answer, neither, wouldn't arrive for another 300 years, but points for trying. The Renaissance spirit of inquiry cracked open the door that superstition had slammed shut. For the first time since antiquity, mushrooms were being studied instead of feared, dissected for texture, sketched for shape, and occasionally eaten for science, with mixed results. In short, humanity had rediscovered curiosity, and immediately started poisoning itself again, but this time with better lighting and perspective technique. The Renaissance gave mushrooms a seat at the intellectual table. It wasn't quite respect, more like cautious fascination. But after centuries in the cellar, even that was progress. By the end of the Renaissance, mushrooms had officially survived everything: religion, superstition, and several rounds of accidental self-poisoning. Humanity had spent thousands of years calling them food, medicine, miracle, and murder weapon. And somehow, the mushrooms just kept showing up. If resilience were an art form, fungi would have their own wing in the Louvre. As Europe tiptoed into the Age of Enlightenment, science began poking around in places faith had politely ignored. Microscope lenses revealed that mushrooms weren't cursed plants or half-formed beasts, but something entirely different, a separate kingdom of life. It was the biological equivalent of learning your quiet neighbour is actually royalty. Naturalists like Carl Linnaeus tried to classify them, though his categories were about as accurate as medieval weather forecasts. Later, Joseph Pitton de Tournefort, an 18th century botanist who sounded like he'd argue with anyone about anything, insisted mushrooms reproduced through seeds invisible to the human eye. He wasn't wrong, just several centuries premature. Meanwhile, fungi were quietly changing the world in ways no philosopher predicted. In bread, in beer, in wine, they were the unseen workforce of civilization. Every monk who brewed ale owed a silent debt to yeast, and every baker to a puff of fungal chemistry. Humanity was basically living off controlled rot. By the 19th century, science had caught up. Mycology, the formal study of fungi, became an actual profession instead of a life-threatening hobby. Doctors began using mold extracts to treat infections. Artists painted mushrooms not as omens, but as objects of beauty. And for the first time, no one got executed for owning a particularly colourful one. Mushrooms had come full circle, from ancient shamans' hallucinogens to Renaissance curiosities to scientific marvels. Even now, they remain everything at once: food, poison, cure, and cosmic mystery. They heal and they kill. They feed empires and fuel enlightenment retreats. They're the universe's reminder that beauty and danger are sometimes the same organism. So, when did humans start using mushrooms? Long before history, long before gods, and long before anyone could spell psychedelic. We didn't find mushrooms. They found us. And ever since, they've been quietly whispering from the forest floor, reminding humanity that the best ideas often begin with a terrible snack and a very bad decision. Before she was a queen, Zenobia was a child of the desert, a daughter of sunburnt stone and wind-blown silk. Born around 240 CE in the caravan city of Palmyra, she grew up surrounded by an empire of contradictions. Palmyra was no ordinary Roman province. It was a meeting point between East and West, where Greek marble met Arabian incense and Latin orders echoed through temples of Babylonian gods. In that strange harmony, Zenobia learned to balance worlds long before she ever ruled one. Her family claimed descent from Cleopatra, and Zenobia seemed determined to live up to that legend. As a girl, she received an education that few men of her age could rival. She spoke Greek, Aramaic, Coptic, and Latin, switching tongues as easily as she switched moods. When she wasn't studying Plato or Egyptian chronicles, she was in the saddle, galloping through the desert dunes with a bow in her hand and a hawk on her arm. Her teachers said she possessed virtues, Roman courage, but her heart belonged to the sands of the East. Palmyra's wealth came from the caravans that threaded through the Silk Road, and young Zenobia often watched from the city gates as merchants from Persia, India, and even China arrived with jewels, spices, and silk. She studied them, their languages, their manners, their weaknesses. Every interaction was a lesson. Every gift of incense or gold was a reminder that power often hides behind trade routes and treaties, not swords. Even in her youth, Zenobia's beauty was noted. Olive skin, dark eyes, a voice that could sound both musical and commanding. But her charm was never her true weapon. It was her intellect, sharp, strategic, and dangerous, that made her unforgettable. She didn't dream of becoming a Roman empress. She dreamed of something greater, an empire of her own, ruled not from Rome, but from the desert heart of Palmyra. By the time she reached adulthood, those around her sensed the pull of destiny. The city's priests called her Bat Zabai, daughter of the gods. Her enemies called her ambitious. Both were right. Beneath the silks and jewels, Zenobia was already sharpening her mind like a blade, preparing for the day the desert would rise. Zenobia's rise to power began beside a man who knew the game of empire, her husband, Odaenathus, the warlord of Palmyra. He was everything a Roman emperor loved in a subordinate: loyal, brutal, and effective. Rome relied on men like him to guard the fragile eastern frontier against Persian invasions. But Odaenathus didn't just serve Rome, he outshone it. When the Persians humiliated Emperor Valerian by capturing him alive, Odaenathus struck back, driving Persian armies deep into their own territory. The Romans celebrated him as the restorer of the East. Zenobia watched quietly, memorizing every move. Their marriage was not the story of a submissive wife and her mighty husband. Odaenathus respected her mind, an unusual trait for the 3rd century. She joined his councils, advised on strategy, and corresponded with Roman governors on his behalf. While he commanded legions, she commanded respect. Together they ruled Palmyra as a city-state within an empire, walking that thin line between loyalty and ambition. But empires are jealous creatures. Rome tolerated Odaenathus so long as he fought their wars, The moment he grew too successful, whispers began to spread that he might make himself emperor of the East. In 267 CE, after a victorious campaign, Odenathus and his eldest son were assassinated. No one ever proved who ordered it. Some say it was a Roman plot, others blame a relative with royal envy. A few even whisper that Zenobia herself had a hand in it, though no evidence survived. What is certain is this: she did not grieve long. The throne of Palmyra passed to her young son, Vaballathus, and Zenobia, as his regent, seized real power. Rome expected a puppet queen. What they got was a strategist wrapped in silk. She put on mourning black, but beneath the veil was iron. She reformed the army, tightened the caravan trade, and secured alliances with desert tribes. Courtiers began to notice that every decision in Palmyra now carried her signature. To the Romans, she sent polite letters affirming loyalty. To her generals, she gave quiet orders to prepare for expansion. The widow of Odenathus was done being second in command. The desert had lost its general, but gained its queen. By the early 270s, Palmyra was no longer just a city of merchants. It was an empire in everything but name. Zenobia ruled from her marble palace like a woman possessed by vision. Her court mixed Greek philosophers, Persian nobles, Arab warriors, and Egyptian priests, a council that mirrored the cultural kaleidoscope of her realm. She spoke to each in their own language, switching tongues mid-sentence, leaving foreign envoys dazzled and disarmed. Rome saw a provincial regent. The East saw a new Cleopatra. Zenobia knew symbols mattered. She minted coins showing her son Vaballathus wearing the laurel wreath of Roman emperors, while she herself appeared as Augusta, the title reserved for empresses. To Rome, this was a polite provocation. To her people, it was a declaration. Palmyra was equal to Rome, not beneath it. Her palace was filled with scholars debating Plato and military men sharpening their swords. It was philosophy and conquest in perfect rhythm, exactly how Zenobia liked it. She spent her mornings on horseback reviewing troops, archers from the desert tribes, armoured cataphracts from Persia, and mercenaries from as far as Cappadocia. The army of Palmyra was not large, but it was fast, loyal, and personally devoted to their queen. They called her Septimia Zenobia, Mother of the East. Her leadership wasn't theatrical, it was magnetic. She ate with her soldiers, rode with them through dust storms, and was said to endure hunger and thirst as they did. But beneath all this brilliance was a slow, deliberate rebellion. Zenobia began to govern like an empress independent of Rome. She raised her own taxes, issued her own decrees, and even opened negotiations with Persia, Rome's mortal enemy. When her advisers warned her that the Romans might not tolerate such arrogance, she smiled and said, "Let them come across the desert if they dare." Palmyra had become the envy of the East, wealthy, secure, radiant under her rule. Trade routes stretching from the Nile to the Indus passed through her city, and the caravans paid homage not to Caesar, but to her. Zenobia was still careful with her words, but her actions had already shouted the truth across continents. A new empire had risen from the sand, and its throne belonged to a woman. By 270 CE, Zenobia's ambitions could no longer be hidden behind diplomacy. The Roman Empire was weak. Emperors rose and fell like desert mirages, and Zenobia saw the chaos not as tragedy, but as invitation. Her eyes turned south toward Egypt, the ancient jewel of the Nile, the breadbasket of Rome, and, in her mind, a rightful part of her dominion. Egypt, after all, had once been ruled by Cleopatra, her claimed ancestor. To conquer it would not merely expand her borders, it would seal her legend. When Roman control in Egypt faltered, Zenobia acted swiftly. She dispatched her general Zabdas with an army of 70,000 archers, cavalry, and seasoned desert fighters. They swept across the Sinai like a sandstorm. The Roman governor of Egypt, Tenagino Probus, tried to resist, but he underestimated the Palmyrene resolve. Within weeks, Alexandria fell. Egypt, the crown of the East, had bent the knee to Zenobia. It was a stunning victory. For the first time in centuries, a woman outside Rome ruled both Syria and Egypt. Merchants in Antioch began to mint coins with her image. Poets compared her to Semiramis and Isis. Her empire now stretched from the Bosporus to the Nile. Palmyra stood as the new capital of the East, a city whose wealth and splendour rivaled Rome itself. Zenobia administered her new province with precision. She secured the grain shipments, reorganized trade, and allowed Egyptian priests to restore their temples, winning the loyalty of both merchants and mystics. To her subjects, she was not a conqueror, but a liberator, promising order in a world where Rome offered only corruption. But with glory came danger. Rome could overlook one rebellious queen on the frontier, but not one who controlled its food supply. The new emperor, Aurelian, was a soldier of iron discipline, not the type to tolerate independence. He began preparing his legions for a campaign unlike any other, not against barbarians, but against a cultured, cunning woman who dared to call herself his equal. For now, Zenobia basked in triumph. She had conquered Egypt, defied Rome, and written her name into the desert's wind. Yet even she knew, the higher one climbs the dunes, the harder the fall when the storm comes. With Egypt under her rule, Zenobia's empire gleamed like a mirage turned real. From her throne in Palmyra, she ruled lands that stretched from the Black Sea to the Red Sea, from the Nile to the Euphrates. Her banners fluttered over cities once loyal to Rome: Antioch, Emesa, Damascus. The trade routes that had once filled Rome's coffers now filled hers. For a brief, dazzling moment, the East was hers alone. She governed with the precision of a Roman and the flair of an Eastern monarch. Her court became a magnet for scholars, poets, and philosophers. Cassius Longinus, a Greek intellectual famed for his work on the sublime, served as her chief adviser. He called her a ruler fit for history's envy. Under her command, Palmyra blossomed into a cultural capital, its columns rising like golden ribs against the desert sky, its markets buzzing with traders from India, Persia, and Arabia. Zenobia herself was a paradox. She dressed like a Roman empress but ruled like a pharaoh. She read Homer in Greek but offered sacrifices to Syrian gods. She could recite Virgil at dinner and issue death sentences before dessert. Her courtiers adored her, her soldiers feared her, and her enemies. Well, they couldn't quite decide whether to bow or to run. But Rome was watching. Emperor Aurelian had crushed rebellions in the west and restored discipline to the legions. He heard reports of Zenobia styling herself Augusta, placing her face beside his on coins, and daring to call her son Emperor of the East. To a Roman general, that wasn't ambition, that was treason. Still, Zenobia held her ground. She knew the sands of the East better than any Roman. She reinforced city walls, stockpiled grain, and secured alliances with nomadic tribes. To her people she promised freedom from Rome's corruption. To her enemies she promised swift punishment. She was no longer the regent queen of Palmyra. She was the sovereign of an empire. Her rule was a balancing act of intellect and audacity, of silk and steel. Yet beneath the splendour of her desert court, tension coiled like a serpent. Rome would not stay quiet forever, and Zenobia's empire, however glorious, rested on the shifting sands of destiny. By 271 CE, the mirage of peace began to waver. Zenobia's empire stood radiant, but the desert winds carried whispers. Rome was stirring. Emperor Aurelian, a man of relentless will, had already restored discipline to a broken empire. He crushed revolts in Gaul and Dalmatia, reunited lost provinces, and reforged the Roman machine into something fearsome again. He called himself Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, and restoring the world meant reclaiming the East from its rebel queen. Zenobia knew this day would come. She had fortified Palmyra and placed garrisons across Syria and Egypt, turning the desert into a labyrinth of defence. Her generals, Zabdas and Zabai, commanded loyal troops trained to fight with speed and cunning. Yet, she also understood the magnitude of her challenge. Rome had legions, siege engines, and a reputation that made entire nations tremble. She had courage, gold, and the faith of her people. While Rome marched, Zenobia played her last diplomatic cards. She sent envoys to Persia, hoping for an alliance against their mutual foe. She reached out to Arabia and Armenia, promising trade and protection. But kings are cowards when Rome is strong, and her pleas found little echo. She stood alone beneath the desert sun, ruler of an empire admired, but not defended by its neighbours. Aurelian moved east with terrifying speed. City after city surrendered without a fight, preferring Roman mercy to Palmyrene wrath. When Antioch fell, Zenobia realized this was no border skirmish. It was an existential war. Still, she refused to flee. She ordered her armies to regroup and confront Aurelian's forces at Imae. The queen herself rode among the troops, wearing armour of gold and bronze, her black hair bound like a warrior's crown. To the soldiers, she was not merely a ruler. She was a symbol, proof that even Rome could bleed. But Aurelian was not the kind to underestimate a woman. He studied her movements, anticipated her traps, and prepared to strike where she least expected. The desert would soon witness a duel unlike any before, the iron will of Rome against the burning pride of Palmyra. Zenobia had built an empire out of courage. Now she would need it to survive. The clash came in 272 CE near the city of Imae, under a sky heavy with desert heat. Zenobia's army, proud and seasoned, faced Aurelian's disciplined legions, the queen's banners fluttering like flames against the Roman eagle. At first, fortune seemed to favour her. Her cavalry, those fierce cataphracts clad in glittering bronze, smashed into the Roman lines with thunderous precision. Aurelian's troops staggered, the desert trembling under hooves and steel. For a moment, it looked as though Palmyra might truly defy the empire that once ruled the world. But Aurelian was cunning. He feigned retreat, a classic Roman ploy, luring Zenobia's cavalry deep into the open plains. Under the punishing sun, the heavily armoured Palmyrans began to slow, their horses gasping for water. Then Aurelian struck. His fresh reserves swept in from the flanks, encircling the exhausted riders. What began as triumph turned to disaster. When the dust settled, Zenobia's forces were broken, her banners trampled beneath Roman boots. Yet the queen did not surrender. She retreated to Emesa, rallying survivors and refusing to accept defeat. From there, she withdrew further to Palmyra itself, her desert fortress, her heart, her symbol. Behind the city's colossal walls, she prepared for a siege that would test her will and her people's faith. Inside Palmyra, morale was high at first. Zenobia walked the ramparts daily, encouraging her soldiers, promising that the gods favoured the east. Her presence alone was enough to turn fear into defiance. Chroniclers say she appeared with the courage of a man and the grace of a goddess. But beyond those walls, the horizon burned. Aurelian's legions surrounded the city, cutting off supplies, water, and trade. The desert that had once been her greatest ally now became her prison. Weeks stretched into months. Starvation and thirst gnawed at Palmyra's resolve. Still, Zenobia would not yield. "Better to die as a queen than live as a slave," she declared. Her generals whispered of one last escape, across the Euphrates, to the Persians. And as night fell over the crumbling city, Zenobia made her choice. She would not await capture behind stone walls. The Queen of the East would ride once more into the darkness, chasing the last hope left to her empire. Under the cover of night, Zenobia slipped out of Palmyra on a swift camel, her jewels hidden beneath coarse desert robes. With a small escort, she rode east toward the Euphrates, hoping to cross into Persian lands before Aurelian could close the net. The desert wind howled around her like a chorus of ghosts. Soldiers, lovers, and merchants who had once called her queen. Each mile she rode was a gamble. each breath a prayer. If she could reach Persia, she might rally allies and return in glory. But fate, like the desert, is merciless. Aurelian's scouts were faster. As dawn broke, they spotted her party near the river. Roman cavalry thundered across the plain, the sun glinting off their armour like blades of light. Zenobia urged her camel forward, desperate to reach the opposite bank, but exhaustion betrayed her. Her mount faltered in the shallows, and Roman hands seized her reins. The warrior queen of Palmyra, the woman who had defied Rome itself, was taken alive. When the news reached Palmyra, the city's spirit broke. Her generals surrendered, her troops laid down their arms, and the gates were opened to Aurelian. The conqueror entered not as a destroyer, but as a grim victor. He admired Zenobia, respected her courage, even as he paraded her defeat. "You dared much," he reportedly told her, "and for that, history will remember you." In chains of gold, Zenobia was brought before him. Even in captivity, she refused to grovel. Her voice, calm and proud, cut through the Roman tent like a dagger. "I fought," she said, "for my people's freedom. Would you have done less?" Aurelian did not answer. He did not need to. Victory already had. Palmyra was punished, but not erased. Its temples were looted, its treasury seized, yet its memory endured. Zenobia, once a ruler of half the East, was led away to Rome, where her final chapter would unfold in spectacle and silence. As the desert winds swept through her fallen city, they carried whispers of her defiance, a queen who rose higher than any dared to dream, and fell not from weakness, but from daring too greatly. The empire had reclaimed its lands, but the legend of Zenobia had already conquered time itself. When Zenobia arrived in Rome, she was no longer a queen but a captive, yet even in chains, she turned heads. Crowds lined the streets to see the woman who had dared to rival the Caesars. On that day of Aurelian's triumph, the city erupted in celebration. Elephants, gold, exotic prisoners, and, at the heart of it all, Zenobia, bound in golden chains, so heavy she could scarcely walk. The Romans expected humiliation, but what they saw was majesty. Her eyes did not lower, her gait did not falter. She walked through the jeering masses with the poise of a monarch returning from victory, not ruin. Aurelian, ever pragmatic, understood the value of spectacle. Executing her would make her a martyr. Parading her would make her a symbol. So he spared her life. According to Roman accounts, he granted her a villa in Tibur, modern Tivoli, where she lived out her remaining years in comfort, surrounded by gardens and philosophy. Some say she married a Roman senator and became a respected matron. Others believe she spent her days quietly teaching her children, reminding them of the city once called Palmyra, the bride of the desert. History, as always, refuses to confirm which version is true. But what survived, and still burns, is her legend. To her enemies, she was a rebel who defied the empire. To her admirers, she was a philosopher queen, the last light of the classical world before it dimmed into the dark ages. She ruled with intellect instead of inheritance, audacity instead of permission. In an age when women were expected to adorn thrones, not seize them, Zenobia rode into history with a sword in one hand and a scholar's scroll in the other. Palmyra would never regain its glory. The sands reclaimed its streets, its columns crumbled, and its empire vanished into dust. Yet Zenobia's name endured, whispered by historians, sculpted by poets, painted by romantics. She became what every conqueror secretly fears, and every dreamer secretly adores, a reminder that empires can be built not just by men with armies, but by women with vision. Her story closes not with defeat, but with defiance, the echo of a queen whose courage outlasted her crown. In the shining heart of classical Athens, the city that gave birth to democracy, theatre, and philosophy, half the population lived behind closed doors. While men gathered in the agora to argue about justice and freedom, women moved like shadows through private courtyards, forbidden from public debate and civic life. Athens celebrated liberty, but only for men. For women, virtue meant silence, modesty, and invisibility. An Athenian woman was not a citizen. She could not vote, own property independently, or represent herself in court. Her name was rarely spoken outside her family. To mention a respectable woman in public was considered improper. Even her face was often hidden, her life measured by obedience and discretion. And yet, beneath this veil of anonymity, she was essential. Every home, every lineage, every fragment of domestic order depended on her. From the moment of birth, her destiny was decided by gender. A boy would be lifted into his father's arms, presented to the gods, and raised to speak in the assembly. A girl would be swaddled in silence. Her education focused on household skills, spinning, weaving, child-rearing, and modesty, the arts of survival within the walls. Her father would arrange her marriage, usually before she reached 16, and she would move directly from his authority to her husband's. The legal term for her was kurios, meaning guardian. A woman could not exist in Athens without one. Yet the system that confined her also depended on her. She managed slaves, oversaw food and finances, produced the city's next generation, and ensured that her family's name remained honourable. The irony was striking. She was both excluded and indispensable. Men debated the future of Athens. Women maintained its present. At night, when the city's torches dimmed, women's voices echoed softly through the courtyards, teaching songs to children, whispering myths, and passing down wisdom in ways the philosophers never recorded. They might have been invisible in public, but their influence seeped through every household, shaping the morals and values that sustained Athenian life. They were the quiet architects of civilization, unseen, unheard, and yet inescapably vital. For all its ideals of reason and freedom, Athens rested on foundations laid by women the city refused to see. For an Athenian woman, the home was her universe, and the Gymnasium was its centre. This women's quarter, often located deep within the house, was both sanctuary and prison. Its purpose was simple: to separate women from the outside world. In Athens, a respectable woman did not wander the streets or mingle freely. Her duty was to remain within, preserving her virtue and her family's honour. The city prized the unseen woman, silent, modest, invisible, the very opposite of the courtesans and priestesses who moved freely in public. Within the Gymnasium, she reigned with quiet authority. She managed the household's finances, directed slaves, and supervised the weaving, one of the most respected domestic crafts in Athens. Weaving was more than a chore. It was symbolic of womanhood itself. To spin thread and create order from chaos was to mirror the divine work of Athena, patron goddess of both wisdom and weaving. Through this skill, women connected their domestic labour to something sacred. But this realm of order was also isolation. The only regular visitors a woman might see were family members and servants. Festivals provided rare moments of escape, like the Thesmophoria, a women's only celebration of fertility held in honour of Demeter. For 3 days each year, wives gathered outside the home, laughing, feasting, and performing secret rites far from male eyes. It was both religious devotion and rebellion, a brief taste of freedom before returning to confinement. Marriage cemented her enclosure. Once a bride entered her husband's home, she became mistress of the oikos, or household, but her power ended at the threshold. If she stepped beyond it without permission, tongues would wag, and her reputation could crumble. Even when her husband entertained guests, she was expected to stay out of sight, to be heard through servants, not through her own words. Yet inside those walls, she ruled with discipline and skill. She planned meals, ensured that slaves worked efficiently, and maintained the family's wealth. Every thread woven, every coin saved, every child raised bore her unseen influence. To the world, she was confined. Within her household, she was sovereign. The Gymnasium was her cage, but also her kingdom. In Athens, marriage was not a matter of love. It was an alliance, a transaction designed to preserve family honour and ensure legitimate heirs. A young woman, often no more than 14 or 15, was given by her father to a husband twice her age. The man's role was to provide protection and lineage. The woman's was to bear children and maintain the home. Romantic affection, if it existed at all, was a luxury reserved for poets. In the real world, marriage was an exchange of property, a dowry for respectability, fertility for social stability. The dowry, negotiated between families, was a woman's silent companion. It was her contribution to the union, but also her tether. Should the marriage dissolve, the husband was legally bound to return it, not out of generosity, but to prevent dishonour to her father's household. In Athens, reputation was currency, and a woman's behaviour reflected directly upon the men who owned her, father, husband, and sons. A single scandal could stain generations. The Athenian wife was expected to be loyal, modest, and discreet. Her public absence was her virtue, her chastity, her value. Her husband, meanwhile, was under no such restraint. He could entertain courtesans, visit hetairai, educated companions, and attend symposia filled with music, wine, and flirtation. Yet if his wife so much as spoke too freely to another man, her reputation could be destroyed. The double standard was not accidental, it was the architecture of control. Motherhood was the cornerstone of her worth. Bearing a son secured her position within the family and the city. A woman who failed to produce heirs risked being cast aside, replaced by another bride, or relegated to quiet irrelevance. Her role was sacred yet precarious. She gave life to citizens, but was denied citizenship herself. Still, within this system, women carved subtle power. A clever wife could manage her husband's estate, influence his decisions, and guide her children's futures. Through restraint and intelligence, she could become indispensable, the quiet strategist behind the facade of male authority. Marriage in Athens was not a union of equals, but a negotiation between visibility and survival. Behind every respectable man stood a woman, invisible yet essential, her dignity maintained through silence and strength. In the eyes of Athens, a woman's highest calling was motherhood, not for personal fulfillment, but for the service of the city. To bear children, especially sons, was considered her most patriotic act. The philosopher Pericles himself once declared that the glory of a woman was not to be talked about among men, yet every Athenian man owed his existence, education, and inheritance to the woman society refused to name. When a boy was born, his arrival was celebrated publicly. His father held him high before household gods, and later registered him as a citizen. The mother, meanwhile, recovered in silence. If a daughter was born, the ceremony was quieter, almost an afterthought. Girls were blessings for domestic continuity, but boys were the pillars of democracy. Athenian law was clear. Only a child born to an Athenian father and mother could become a citizen. This made wives vital, even as they were excluded from public life. Their wombs guarded the purity of the polis. The responsibilities of motherhood were immense. From infancy, the mother oversaw her children's care, discipline, and early education. Sons stayed with their mothers and nurses until the age of 7, learning stories of heroes, gods, and morality. These tales, often told at night by lamplight, were more formative than any classroom. They shaped the next generation's ideals before philosophy ever touched them. Daughters, meanwhile, were prepared for the same cycle: domestic skill, modesty, and obedience. Motherhood carried its own moral weight. A good mother was expected to embody restraint, wisdom, and loyalty. If a child dishonoured his family, the mother's name was whispered with blame. Her virtue extended beyond the home. It defined the moral fibre of Athenian society. Yet, despite this sacred duty, women had no control over their children's legal fates. Fathers could expose infants they deemed unwanted, a grim decision made without a mother's consent. Her role ended at the boundary between nurture and law. Still, the mother's influence lingered long after her silence. Her songs shaped citizens, her discipline moulded soldiers, Her compassion softened philosophers. Though Athens denied her voice in the assembly, she spoke through generations, her wisdom hidden in every citizen who once rested in her arms. In Athens, education was the pride of every free man, and the quiet exclusion of every woman. Boys studied rhetoric, music, and philosophy to prepare for citizenship. Girls learned obedience, thrift, and the art of invisibility. A boy's mind was sharpened for debate. A girl's was moulded for discretion. To educate a woman was seen as unnecessary, even dangerous. Knowledge, after all, led to independence, and independence was the one luxury no Athenian woman could afford. A girl's schooling began at home. Her mother or nurse taught her domestic skills, how to spin wool, bake bread, mix perfume, and manage servants. She learned how to keep accounts, how to ration food, and how to move quietly through her own house. The loom was her textbook, the spindle her diploma. Even stories, myths, and songs were filtered through the lens of morality. The message was always the same: modesty, restraint, silence. There were, of course, rare exceptions. Families wealthy or eccentric enough to educate their daughters. These women could read the epics, quote the poets, even write letters. But their intelligence was meant to remain private, a quiet ornament to their virtue. A woman too clever, too outspoken, risked ridicule or suspicion. The Greeks admired Athena, goddess of wisdom, but would never tolerate a mortal woman who acted like her. By contrast, education for boys was a public affair: gymnasia, tutors, and philosophical discussions in the agora. They learned to argue, to lead, to make laws. Athenian democracy depended on eloquence, yet half its population was deliberately kept voiceless. This divide was not ignorance by accident, it was policy. Silence preserved order. Ironically, the women who were most educated were not the wives of citizens, but the hetairai, high-class courtesans who entertained men in symposia. These women studied philosophy, poetry, and politics so they could engage men's intellects. They were outsiders, yet they moved in circles forbidden to respectable wives. It was the cruelest of paradoxes. Athens feared educated women, but paid them handsomely to speak. In a city that worshipped the mind, the female intellect was hidden like contraband. And yet, through whispers, songs, and bedtime stories, women passed down their own lessons, the quiet wisdom that no philosopher could silence. Though excluded from politics, Athenian women found power where men feared to tread, in the sacred world of the gods. Religion offered them a rare stage, a realm where their voices, movements, and rituals shaped the spiritual rhythm of the city. Within temples and festivals, women were not shadows. They were conduits between the mortal and divine. The most honoured role a woman could hold was that of a priestess. Unlike civic offices, which were closed to women, priesthoods carried genuine authority and respect. The priestess of Athena Polias at the Parthenon ranked among the most influential figures in Athens, consulted by generals, revered by citizens, and paid by the state. Her word could bless armies or condemn decisions. In a world where men made laws, she made meaning. Religious festivals gave all women, rich or poor, brief freedom from the confines of the home. During the Thesmophoria, wives gathered in secret to honour Demeter, goddess of fertility and harvest. For 3 days, the city belonged to them. They feasted, joked, performed ancient fertility rites, and spoke freely about marriage, men, and childbirth. No husbands were allowed to attend. To the male eye, it was a mystery. To women, it was liberation. Other festivals, like the Panathenaea, allowed women to participate in civic life symbolically. They wove the peplos, a sacred robe, for the statue of Athena, a labour of piety and pride. When the finished garment was carried in grand procession to the Parthenon, it was both a religious offering and a statement of quiet presence. Women might not speak in the assembly, but their work adorned the city's goddess. Religious roles blurred the lines of gender. A woman who could not step into the agora could step into a temple. She might not debate laws, but she could interpret omens, oversee rituals, and mediate with the divine. Within this sacred sphere, Women wielded a kind of invisible sovereignty, not through force or law, but through faith. In a society that confined them, religion became their loophole. Behind veils and incense smoke, Athenian women claimed a form of dignity that even the philosophers could not explain, the power to stand before the gods as equals. If the Athenian wife was expected to be silent, the courtesan, or hetaira, was celebrated for her voice. Athens divided its women into two worlds, the respectable and the desirable. The wife guarded the home, the courtesan animated the symposium. One was expected to embody virtue, the other intellect. And yet, both roles revealed the same truth, that a woman's value was always measured through the lens of men. Respectable wives lived behind the walls of the oikos, managing servants and raising children, rarely seen by anyone but family. The hetairae, by contrast, were educated, witty, and politically aware. They attended feasts, discussed philosophy with poets and generals, and even influenced decisions whispered over wine. Men who silenced their wives in daylight eagerly sought conversation with hetairae after sunset. It was hypocrisy dressed as culture. Among these women, figures like Aspasia of Miletus became legendary. Partner to Pericles, she hosted gatherings of the city's greatest minds, Socrates, Anaxagoras, and others, all men who claimed to value wisdom, yet denied it to their own wives. Aspasia was both admired and vilified, admired for her intellect, condemned for possessing it. Her existence proved that Athenian men respected intelligence in women, just not when it belonged to their own. The life of a hetaira was not easy. Freedom came at the price of legitimacy. She could earn wealth, own property, and travel, but she could never marry an Athenian citizen or bear legitimate heirs. Respectable women envied their autonomy. Men desired their company. Society condemned them. They lived at the border between admiration and disgrace. The contrast between wife and courtesan revealed Athens' great paradox. The city that built the Parthenon, a temple to wisdom itself, believed that the mind of a woman was dangerous unless it was safely hidden or publicly shamed. The wife existed to protect lineage, the courtesan to entertain intellect. Both served the polis, though in opposite ways. Behind closed doors or beside silver goblets, women shaped Athens more deeply than its laws admitted. One governed the household, the other governed conversation. Between them, they embodied the city's divided soul: reason and restraint, love and control, intellect and invisibility. The laws of Athens were written by men, for men, and against women who stepped beyond their prescribed boundaries. An Athenian woman could not represent herself in court. She was legally invisible, a possession transferred from her father to her husband. Her Kyrios, her legal guardian, spoke on her behalf, made contracts in her name, and even decided her fate. The city that prided itself on freedom treated women as perpetual minors, forever in need of supervision. Adultery was the gravest crime a woman could commit, not because it betrayed love, but because it threatened legitimacy. A citizen's wife was the vessel of inheritance. If her loyalty was questioned, so too was the purity of the family line. The law allowed a husband to kill an adulterer caught in the act without trial. The wife, however, faced social death, divorce, exile, and disgrace. Her lover died quickly. She died slowly, through whispers and isolation. For men, moral expectations were flexible. They could visit courtesans, take concubines, or engage in liaisons without losing honour. Their pleasure was seen as natural, women's desire as dangerous. Philosophers justified this imbalance with reasoned absurdity. Aristotle declared that women were incomplete men, emotional, impulsive, and in need of rule. Even Plato, who imagined a city of equality in his Republic, limited his idealism to theory. In Athens itself, freedom was a male luxury. The courtroom and the gossip circle worked together to enforce control. Scandals spread faster than justice. A woman accused of impropriety might never face trial, but her reputation could be ruined by rumour alone. In a society obsessed with honour, shame was the most efficient weapon. Silence was both defense and punishment. Yet even within this cage of laws, women learned the rules well enough to bend them. Some used religion as refuge, others managed estates through trusted slaves or sons. A clever widow could protect her property and influence politics indirectly. The system was designed to limit them, but it also relied on their obedience, and that dependence gave them leverage. The law claimed to define morality, but morality was often a mask for control. Athens was built on justice, but its foundation rested on silence. The silence of women whose restraint kept the city's illusion of order intact. For all their invisibility, Athenian women were the quiet engineers of the city's endurance. The men of Athens built temples and debated philosophy, but it was women who sustained the rhythm of daily life, who wove, fed, birthed, mourned, and remembered. Their contributions were so deeply woven into the fabric of society that they became invisible, mistaken for mere tradition rather than power. Every Athenian home was an ecosystem held together by female labour. Women organised servants, stored grain, managed accounts, and ensured that estates passed smoothly through generations. When husbands left for war or trade, wives became de facto heads of household, negotiating with merchants and supervising the farmhands. The city's economy depended on women's unseen work as much as it did on male commerce in the agora. The irony was profound. Athens taught that freedom made a man civilized, yet civilization itself rested on the unfree labour of women. In myth, however, their power surfaced openly. Athena, patron of the city, was a goddess of wisdom and warfare, an immortal woman embodying virtues men claimed as their own. Women like Penelope, who ruled her household with cunning patience, or Antigone, who defied unjust law, stood as literary mirrors of real Athenian endurance. The stories men told to entertain themselves often revealed the very strengths they denied existed in living women. Even the art that adorned the Parthenon, those graceful reliefs of goddesses and priestesses, was a quiet confession. Men might carve marble, but they immortalized women in it. Every woven peplos, every domestic shrine, every whispered prayer tied women to Athens' cultural heartbeat. By the late Classical Age, the cracks in this silence began to show. Philosophers debated virtue, dramatists questioned power, and playwrights like Euripides gave women sharp tongues and sharper minds. The city's walls might confine its women, but its stories could not. Through myth, art, and memory, they found a voice that history could not erase. In the end, Athenian women were both prisoners and pillars, bound by custom, yet essential to its survival. They were the unseen architects of the world's first democracy, denied a vote, but shaping the civilization that would one day debate equality itself. When the ashes of Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii in 79 CE, they sealed not only its buildings, but its voices. For centuries, the city slept under volcanic rock, perfectly preserved, waiting to speak again. When archaeologists began digging it out in the 18th century, they didn't just uncover villas, temples, and mosaics. They uncovered something far more intimate: graffiti. Thousands of casual inscriptions scrawled across the city's walls in charcoal, paint, or even carved with a nail. Crude, funny, romantic, obscene. These scribbles were the raw thoughts of everyday Romans, frozen in stone. Unlike the grand Latin of Cicero or Virgil, Pompeii's graffiti belonged to ordinary citizens: merchants, lovers, drunkards, slaves, and soldiers. Some were barely literate, others surprisingly poetic. You can almost hear their voices, centuries later. One man wrote, "Successus loves Iris, but she doesn't care for him. Too bad." Another declared, "Gaius was here." It's the same impulse that drives people to carve initials into park benches or comment online. The need to say, "I existed." The walls of Pompeii became a kind of public diary. There were love confessions, political endorsements, and petty insults. "If anyone doesn't believe in Venus, they should look at my girlfriend," one proud lover bragged. In a public bath, someone scrawled, "Secundus defecated here. Badly." On another wall, "Oh walls, you've endured so many insipid scribblings. I'm amazed you haven't collapsed." The irony would have made any modern graffiti artist proud. This wasn't vandalism in the modern sense. It was participation. In a city without paper, walls were fair game. They spoke for the people who had no monuments, for the slave who couldn't write a will, for the soldier far from home, for the prostitute, the gambler, and the baker. The wall was the one place they could shout their truth. Today, these scratched messages make Pompeii feel startlingly alive. Through them, we don't just see Rome's grandeur, we hear its laughter, jealousy, boredom, and loneliness. Each message, no matter how crude, bridges 2,000 years of silence. It's as if the dead city itself is whispering, "We lived, we joked, we loved, we were just like you." Pompeii's walls were a blank canvas for its rowdy citizens, and nowhere was the ink wetter than in its bars, bathhouses, and brothels. Romans didn't write graffiti in libraries or temples. They wrote it where the wine flowed, the gossip spread, and inhibitions dissolved. These were places of laughter and indulgence, where a man could flirt, boast, or vent without consequence, or so he thought. 2,000 years later, we're still reading his drunken thoughts. In one tavern, someone scrawled, "I came here, I drank, I messed up." Another, probably the same night, added, "Whoever loves, let them flourish. Whoever doesn't, let them perish. And if anyone stops me, may he burst even in a city filled with tragedy. The humour of its people still lingers like the smell of old wine." Pompeii was loud, and its graffiti makes sure we hear it. Bars were the ancient Roman equivalent of Twitter, quick thoughts written for strangers. Some inscriptions are no longer than a single insult. Apollinaris is a thief. Others are declarations of ego. Celadus, the Thracian gladiator, makes the girls moan. Pompeii's walls didn't just serve as entertainment. They were reputation boards. To be named on a wall could be an act of love, revenge, or pure chaos. In the city's bathhouses, where the wealthy and poor alike mingled naked under hot steam, graffiti took on a new tone, playful, competitive, and occasionally anatomical. One bather carved, "I don't want to leave. The heat feels like Venus herself." Another wrote the less poetic, "I scratched my back and now I feel divine." These weren't polished lines from poets. They were the casual remarks of people living vividly in the moment. And then there were the brothels, the most famous walls of all. The erotic frescoes inside the Lupanar, Pompeii's main brothel, were matched by graffiti ranging from cheeky reviews to explicit advertisements. "Restituta," one client wrote, "was here with her friend. She's worth every coin together." These walls form an unfiltered record of Pompeian nightlife. Loud, unashamed, and utterly human. The Romans may have worshipped marble gods, but when they picked up a piece of charcoal, they worshipped something else entirely: honesty. If there's one thing Roman graffiti proves, it's that love, in all its messy, hormonal, and ridiculous forms, hasn't changed in 2,000 years. The walls of Pompeii were covered with declarations of passion, heartbreak, and lust, written by people who clearly didn't believe in keeping emotions private. Love wasn't whispered, it was carved. On one wall, a man confessed, "Successus loves Iris. She doesn't return his affection. Oh, how he weeps." Another scribbled, "I love the girl who scratches her head. She makes me burn." One particularly dramatic soul etched, "If you're in love and don't suffer, you're not doing it right." These weren't poets or philosophers, just ordinary people, aching in the same way every generation does. Some graffiti reads like breakup notes. "Goodbye, my love. You were sweet, but the baker's daughter is sweeter." Others resemble jealous text messages. "Whoever sleeps with my girlfriend will pay." Pompeii was a small city, roughly 11,000 residents, and the walls made gossip immortal. Imagine being dumped publicly in Latin for all eternity, but not every inscription was tender. Pompeii's lovers could also be crude. In brothels, graffiti blurred the line between affection and advertisement. "Attis is the best," reads one, followed by a price. Another boasts, "I had many women here and none like Fortunata." The Romans didn't separate love from lust. They celebrated both with equal enthusiasm. Women, too, left their mark, though less often. One carving, signed by a woman named Floronia, declares boldly, "Greetings to all lovers." Another reads simply, "Metha, drunk again." These rare female voices feel defiant, reclaiming the wall from the constant chatter of men. What's striking is the honesty. There's no censorship, no attempt to sound noble. Love in these inscriptions isn't idealized like in Roman poetry. It's sweaty, jealous, impulsive, and funny. The kind that happens after too much wine or during a stolen moment in a public bath. Through these scrawled hearts and curses, Pompeii reminds us that human emotion has always been loud, chaotic, and painfully sincere. The same hearts that once beat beneath togas now speak to us through stone, still laughing, still longing, still confessing to the walls. Not all graffiti in Pompeii was about love or lust. Some of it was pure politics. The walls doubled as campaign posters, public debates, and personal attacks. Before newspapers or social media, citizens used stone as their comment section. And just like today, it was loud, biased, and occasionally unhinged. During elections, Pompeii's walls were plastered, literally, with endorsements. Professional painters called scriptores were hired to write campaign ads in bold red letters. "Vote for Lucius Papidius Sabinus. He's honest and loves the people." Another reads, "The fruit sellers support Marcus Hulconius Priscus for aedile." Every profession had a favourite candidate. Bakers, mule drivers, even barmaids. Some inscriptions were obviously written by the same hand, suggesting that candidates commissioned graffiti teams, ancient spin doctors at work. But not all political messages were polite. Pompeians loved satire. One wall warns, "The idle vote for Vatia." Another sneers, "If you're looking for corruption, vote for Papidius." Politics, it seems, was always a performance, and the audience always cynical. Even in a city without freedom of speech as we know it, citizens found ways to mock authority. Occasionally, graffiti turned personal. Rival candidates accused each other of theft, drunkenness, or adultery. Someone even wrote, "Vatia is a thief and sleeps with men." It's the Roman version of a political smear campaign, crude, effective, and probably true. The more things change, the more they stay the same. These walls also reveal something deeper: participation. Though women and slaves couldn't vote, they still took part in the noise. Archaeologists found graffiti written by slaves endorsing their masters' friends, loyalty expressed through chalk and plaster. Others simply mocked their betters, enjoying a few lines of rebellion while no one was looking. What makes Pompeii's political graffiti so fascinating is its honesty. The marble inscriptions of Rome glorified emperors. Pompeii's walls captured the gossip of democracy in miniature. It wasn't about ideals. It was about personality, pride, and pettiness. 2,000 years later, the red campaign slogans still cling to walls like faded election posters. They remind us that politics has always been personal, messy, and written where everyone can see, sometimes in ink, sometimes in spray paint, and once upon a time, in wet volcanic plaster. If ancient Rome had a comedy club, it was Pompeii's walls. The city's graffiti shows that Romans loved humour, especially the kind your grandmother wouldn't approve of. They mocked their neighbours, bragged about their exploits, and wrote insults so creative they could make modern comment sections blush. One of the most famous reads, "Secundus defecated here, badly." Another replies underneath, "Thanks for the warning." It's pure bathroom humour, timeless and universal. In another bathhouse, someone wrote, "Apollinaris, doctor of the emperor Titus, had a good time here with 2 girls. He's a lucky man." The Roman sense of humour was raw, personal, and often filthy. They didn't separate art from obscenity. For them, both were expressions of life. Pompeii's humour wasn't limited to bodily jokes. Some graffiti reads like ancient trolling. One message says, "We have wet dreams, walls. Why won't you?" Another declares, "Oh, walls, you've endured so much nonsense. I'm amazed you haven't collapsed." That line could hang in any modern restroom. Even self-deprecation made an appearance. "I'm amazed, oh wall, that you're still standing after all the stupid things written on you." The Romans laughed at themselves, and their graffiti proves they were masters of irony. Insults were another favourite pastime. "Emilius has a small organ," one person carved proudly. Another reads, "Eutychus is cheap, 2 asses." There were jabs about bad lovers, lazy workers, even corrupt officials. Nothing and no one was safe. The walls were democratic in their cruelty. Everyone got roasted. But humour also served as release. Pompeii was a bustling, crowded city. Between the noise of carts, the heat of the baths, and the tension of daily survival, laughter was a survival instinct. The graffiti gave people permission to be ridiculous, to say what couldn't be said out loud. It was therapy, Roman style. What makes this graffiti so endearing is its honesty. These weren't philosophers trying to sound clever. They were ordinary people writing after too much wine, carving their jokes into eternity. The same impulse drives memes today, the urge to mock life's absurdities before life mocks you. Pompeii's walls remind us that humour survives everything, even volcanic ash. Among the thousands of scribbles across Pompeii's walls, one theme appears again and again: names. Gaius was here. Marcus loves Julia. Cornelius the cook. Sometimes the messages say nothing more than a signature, yet these names are perhaps the most haunting graffiti of all. In a world without photography or social media, carving your name was an act of immortality. It said, "Remember me," even if no one ever would. Many Romans bragged about their achievements or strength. One wrote, "I am the best of all scratchers of walls." Another, "Floronius, privileged soldier of the 7th Legion, was here. Why? Because I could." These inscriptions are equal parts arrogance and insecurity, timeless human traits. Pompeii's graffiti reads like a city-wide competition for attention. Every wall a digital feed waiting for likes in the form of glances. Lovers used graffiti the same way we use text messages. "Vibius Restitutus slept here alone and missed his darling Urbana." Another, "Myrtis, you're beautiful," followed by someone else replying underneath, "So is Daphne, fool." The walls became conversations, a kind of ancient comment thread where emotions, rivalries, and friendships played out in real time. Even professions got involved. Bakers, slaves, and soldiers etched their names as proof they existed, even if history would ignore them. In a city where tombstones glorified the wealthy, graffiti gave the poor their own kind of monument. Every name scratched into plaster was a rebellion against anonymity. The beauty lies in the simplicity. These weren't planned inscriptions. They were impulsive, sometimes drunken, moments of existence captured forever. The writer didn't expect an audience beyond tomorrow, yet here we are, 2,000 years later, reading their words. And in that strange way, their wish for immortality worked. Their empires fell, their gods faded, their city burned, but their handwriting survived. We may not know who Marcus was, or whether Julia ever loved him back, but we know they lived and laughed and hoped someone would see their names. Every scratched letter in Pompeii's walls reminds us of one universal truth. Humans have always wanted to be remembered. The Romans didn't build the internet. They built the first wall posts. If Pompeii's walls could blush, the brothels would have kept them red forever. The Lupanar, the city's main brothel, was not just a house of pleasure. It was a museum of graffiti. Its cramped stone rooms, decorated with erotic frescoes, became confessionals where clients, prostitutes, and voyeurs all left their marks. What they wrote wasn't poetry. It was marketing, bragging, and raw humanity carved into plaster. Each small cubicle had its own messages. One reads, "I had a great time here with the girl from Syria." Another boasts, "Myrtis was wonderful. I recommend her to all my friends." It's the ancient version of a 5-star review, scrawled after a glass too many of cheap wine. Some men even competed for the best lines. Restitutus had his fill here. May fortune smile on the next man. Pompeii's brothel graffiti proves that customer feedback existed long before Yelp. But the walls didn't just belong to clients. Women wrote back. One worker, probably tired of being romanticized, carved, "Take your pleasure but pay your price." Another scrawled, "I don't want your love, just your coins." Between the crude jokes and sensual boasts, there's a sharp awareness of survival. For many women, sex work wasn't shameful. It was practical, sometimes even profitable. The imagery in the brothel reinforced the same honesty. Above each door, painted scenes depicted couples in various acts, not to shock, but to advertise. In a city with travellers speaking a dozen languages, images were universal. You didn't need to read Latin to know what was on offer. Outside the lupanar, the graffiti continued into nearby taverns and alleyways. One inscription reads, "Take me home, traveller, for I am tired of this bed." Another adds a touch of weary humour. "If you want to know my name, ask your husband." These lines reveal not sin but storytelling, a chorus of voices too often erased by history. The brothel graffiti of Pompeii exposes the heartbeat of a city that didn't moralize desire, it recorded it. For the Romans, pleasure wasn't hidden. It was carved into stone, advertised on the walls, and lived without apology. The volcano took their bodies, but their laughter and lust survived the ashes. Not all graffiti in Pompeii was bawdy or boastful. Between the dirty jokes and love notes, you find prayers, desperate, grateful, or fearful, scratched by hands that believed the gods might be listening. Faith and profanity shared the same walls, and that's what made Pompeii so human. In one house, someone carved, "Health to you, Lord Mercury, bring me profit." Another inscription near a bakery reads, "For safe return, I offer thanks to Isis." Even in taverns, half-drunk patrons invoked divine protection. "May Bacchus bless this wine." The gods were everywhere, in business, in love, in hangovers. Graffiti wasn't just worship, it was ritual in motion. Romans didn't kneel in silence, they negotiated. A prayer scratched on a wall was a public contract with the divine. "I've given my offering, now you owe me." It's easy to picture a shopkeeper scribbling his plea between customers, or a sailor carving his promise before heading to sea. Other graffiti reflected ordinary life. A schoolroom wall bears the words, "I hate my teacher," written by what must have been an exhausted student. Another, probably by a bored guard, says simply, "Bored." One poor soul scrawled, "Nothing is forever, not even this misery." 2 millennia later, it still hits like a tweet from someone stuck at work on a Monday. Amid the noise of jokes and arguments, these softer voices remind us that Pompeii was not all pleasure and politics. It was real life. Its people prayed for luck, cursed their bosses, complained about the weather, and mocked the powerful. One inscription captures the tone perfectly. "All things pass, even bad emperors." And then there's the eerie irony of hindsight. Near the city's forum, someone wrote shortly before the eruption, "Tomorrow the gods will favour us." Within days, the city was gone. The prayer remained, baked into the wall by volcanic fire. These small inscriptions, some no larger than a coin, show the range of Roman emotion. Reverence, exhaustion, and humour tangled together. The same walls that heard laughter and lust also held whispers to the gods. Pompeii's graffiti wasn't just a reflection of daily life. It was daily life, written in faith and ash. When Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it silenced Pompeii. But not before the city left behind its final diary entries. The graffiti, already centuries old in places, became the last record of voices that never expected to be remembered. The volcano took their lives, yet preserved their jokes, prayers, and insults in molten time. In a way, their words survived longer than any Roman emperor's decree. On the very edge of the city, in a half-finished building, archaeologists found a graffito written just days before the eruption. It reads, "On the 16th day before the calends of November, he ate too much." That date corresponds almost exactly to the day Vesuvius erupted. The man who carved it, joking about indigestion, may have been one of the victims found nearby. Even in the face of disaster, humour was Pompeii's final defence. Every scrawled line became a ghost. Lovers who wrote their names on walls now lie beneath meters of ash, their confessions intact. Successus Love's iris still glows faintly on a house wall. Gaius was here. Yes, he was. For once, immortality didn't belong to kings or philosophers. It belonged to the ordinary. As the centuries passed, the graffiti slept in darkness. When it was rediscovered, scholars were shocked not by its obscenity, but by its humanity. This wasn't the Rome of marble statues. It was the Rome of bar fights, flirtations, and spilled wine. Through graffiti, history speaks not in grand speeches, but in whispers, the scratched laughter of people who thought the moment mattered more than eternity. Today, as tourists walk through Pompeii's streets, they pass those same walls, the ancient comment sections of a lost world. Some are barely visible, faded to ghostly lines. Others are sharp as the day they were written. Together they form a chorus, messy, vulgar, funny, and tender. Pompeii's graffiti reminds us that civilization isn't defined by its monuments but by its words. The Romans who carved into plaster didn't know they were writing to us, but they did what humans always do. They tried to leave a trace. And 2,000 years later, in the ruins of their laughter, we finally answer back, "We see you. We remember."